And again, I think this is where the good companies can differentiate themselves from the bad companies. If you're a good company operating in line with international best practice, then you don't want to have to deal with the bad actors out there who might be engaging in fraud. In good companies, I think it's also important from the company perspective that those contracts can actually benefit to citizens and can help disclosing that contract can help so there's a growing trend, the norm, and are weak or dated. Transparency over available, or at least some contracts available. And growing support from companies too. Here, they can't see one reason confidential. Many emerging including EITI. So just to be it says with respect to the EITI report must disclose the government's disclosure of contracts and licenses, an overview of any contracts and licenses that are already, and EITI countries are encouraged to publicly disclose contracts and licenses. So, kind of a 5-step disclosing contracts, and I think I'll just go over the first two. You can read process. There's a question, or you're just a stakeholder involved in asking yourself with transparency. At the initial stage, every year, they have their work plan for that year. So the question at the work plan phase is the objectives that we've set out and need activities related to section disclosure. In scoping studies, many countries are preparing a report. The question here is, does the scoping plan of the feasibility of contract disclosure? In the reconciler terms of reference, it's great to have they produce reference, and if they decide that they want to cover the report in terms of reference, something they will require transparency in collecting that information. In the reconciliation process, after it's important to keep in mind there's the annual activity where you would want a extended notation made on same for any recommendations. You want to make sure it's all related to contract. Just a preview, which will end with. So just very quickly, very commonly transparency. Because in your discussion on contract transparency, these all contracts. Contracts confidential or hundreds of contracts. And what the majority of the terms, work obligations, local content, employment and training, financial assurance, contract, these are all in the contract, but they are unlikely to cause competitive harm. Be very few terms who cause competitive harm disclosed are unlikely might be disclosed. So that's things like trade secrets, references to future transactions. The second misconception is that disclosure. But it's really important from 2016 implemented agreement from Liberia that almost all of the contract have new this confidentiality provision says all information shall be considered treated as confidential. Subject Section 2 says this confidentiality will not so that's an option there. You have a lot of exception to this confidentiality. It's also important to keep it in contracts. They can be amended. Misconception 3. Transparency contracts will scare off investors. We just go back to that list of U.S., Afghanistan. I can keep going. From Ghana, where available in a country where all of the contracts are public. Fourth and last, contracts are too hard to understand. You hear this a lot. They're just use people. And these are really important to note. There are many, many tools and mechanisms for you to use to understand. And this is a really important role in terms of helping people understand. So you can see the rest of the steps, but again, this is I apologize that we only have one tool that I wanted to share with you and understandable is a platform called resourcecontracts.org, which NRDI created along with the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment and the World Bank, and it's a resource and a platform for annotated versions of contracts. The contract is there along with annotation and how each provision of that contract can be understood. That this is a platform that's available for countries to use. This is actually a website that we the government to create. So if you create this platform, and that'd be. So just to end, the relevance of this is a bit of a segment from very new EITI report, and you can see that it talks about process, organizational, financial, economic, environmental. There is a sample that's available. It includes the link. That's very useful. But it says that legislation disclosure, which is of course different from legislation barring disclosure. Same for production. Some of those key terms that we said were key governance issues. The cost recovery for production and the profit production, the terms that are specified in that contract. A similar how that interaction not being disclosed. And you can see parties to agreement really important. Is a company that's like Ghana where contracts are public. I think that's another part of kind of advocacy. You know, companies may already be disclosing contracts elsewhere. Audits by the CMU, which is good, but again, it opened up the monitoring and audit that's by the cabinet of ministers. Is that sufficient, or does there need to be more? Is on the tax code, but also knowing the tax code is part of it, from the contract itself. Content, I just very quickly watched it because it came up in the discussion today. Again, related to employment preference for Ukrainian employment, Ukrainian goods, but not being. The final is the most important thing that the Ukrainian report can is, and it's a recommendation that in the future, and any other documents concluded between the government and illegal mineral resources need to be part of future. It's a great recommendation. Hopefully, some of the things that have been discussed.
Thank you, Erika. Staying for the questions, maybe that's... I'm very sorry for that. So if you have a need for clarification, please raise your hands. We're all crystal.
Yeah, I'd be really curious if there was who was involved in kind of the, I don't know if there are any of these resources here, but involved in gathering that information, any discussion on contract disclosure, people thought of that recommendation that contract agreements should be dealt with in future reports.
Yeah, one second.
При започаткуванні сировин до нас з'явився представник компанії, яка буде займатися облаштуванням сировин. Але він завжди давав викривлену інформацію про прибуток, чи є свердловини і т.д. Так от, з чого почати, щоб нас не дурили? Скажу так. Ми схвалюємо громадськість і надія в нас з'явилася щось краще.
I mean, I think the is a lot of what in this first report that is step towards closing contracts and a sense of what's out there. Even in producing communities, you know there's a project happening, you know what agreements relate to it, you need what the documentation is. And for at least some things like production agreements, this EITI report disclose the content of those agreements, list what the relevant are. I think the next step in an EITI process, and of course contractors are happy to discuss through EITI, but that is I think the next step is really an open and frank discussion with all of the stakeholders around the table. And you already have a recommendation in your that there should be coverage in the future, I think can be very helpful. But I think that's where it starts, a conversation where you address these questions, because surely in countries, when MSG sit down and have this conversation, that companies say, well, it's confidential, we can't disclose it, or people won't understand it. So that's why I think it's important to kind of ask ready for how to address that. But in other countries, like the Philippines, where we see basically the MSG and saying, look, we want to, these are the lists of documents that need to be made public, and start from there.
Any further questions?
Hi. Could talk a little bit more about this resource contracts that start up and what which countries are what is the reasoning with which countries are on here, stuff like that.
Yeah. It's an ongoing platform. There are at least over 40 countries that are now, and the list is very much responsive to which countries make contracts available. And we only I think in from the so not publicly disclosed contracts that the government. Which countries we have to build country-specific sites? There's the Philippines now. Guinea is another country where we work extensively with the government. We're in discussions right now with countries like Mongolia. So that's kind of just, if there's interest, to try to follow up on that.
Because I know some of the countries that you listed that their contracts, they're not on the, is it because they have own database?
Yeah, some of them, there's a complex kind of matrix for determining which upload, but certainly a functional web system, and they're pretty well, they're easy to find. Those would be less of a priority versus contracts that otherwise are in someone's drawer, and this is a really big value add. But it does take us a bit longer to post contracts.org because they are annotated, which means each contract isn't just posted up there, it's actually reviewed by lawyers and law students, which takes some time.
And for the questions, are MSG members who would want to comment on recommendation in the EITI report?
So, as a member of civil society, I am quite supportive in of contracts. But just remember that we didn't discuss this issue so far, and our main objective was to launch this initiative in our report, and I believe that next year it should be of our discussion in MSG, and I believe that it would make our industry more transparent and improve the situation what we have this moment.
Absolutely, and that's very reasonable. A lot of the focus on the first report is just kind of getting it out of the door. The additional elements are only things that MSDs have with to think about. I think another thing with this, also all of them, is that you don't have to wait for, like, if you want to start a process. And one of the things I didn't discuss in this version is, some countries decide, okay, we just all the close new contracts going forward. There are ways of dealing with resources I'll completely understand in terms of kind of rolling on a one-by-one basis, not waiting for the next report in the country. So it's completely reasonable, that approach.
There is actually leaked contracts that you might be interested in. Crane in there. Open Oil, they contracts on their website, and if you've got a lot of graduate contracts now published on the website, and if there's any contract from Ukraine org. Secondly, a chip initiative called the Open Contract that really looks at open contracting processes, and they in Ukraine, but their website gives a wealth of information on how to procurement process. Thirdly, as Erica already it's not the only platform through which you can sort of push quite a few information is that to sort of push for to open up it's not always successfully, but it's another sort of outlet, another mechanism to use.
That's okay, we'll move on to the next session, which is a common session between Marinka and myself about environmental. Does this one work? A few bits to flag at the beginning. So first of all, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because in Russian it might not be as useful to you, and it would be more for myself. So I hope that's fine. But I'm happy to send around notes or summarize if it's it's easier for you. The other thing, I'm not an expert on environmental or social questions. It's about stimulating some debate on how the situation is in Ukraine and how you think the EITI could be a relevant tool for environmental and social information. So that being said, I thought I could answer the question briefly in an overview that was done by our partners in a network of NGOs called RME, who researched the of environment and social pressure in Latin America with the ITI. So I'll summarize some of the findings from there, and also part on change and how it is or how the ITI should out front America. So to start with, obviously, I'll ask, what is transparency about environmental information? Because that's very, very important, you can imagine. And there are many things that come into play when you think about social and environmental impacts, consumption, pollution of land or atmosphere, of water, the land use, rehabilitation of a site, human rights abuses around the site, etc., etc. So really trying to understand what are the different kinds of impacts, environmental impacts of. We tried through the report to look at what the different types of the impact and what is the and in the report there's some types of information that will be relevant to audiences, but there's a lot of information about actors, so who is involved in the claim and ask for accountability and those involved. Used licenses again so that there are understandable mechanisms, the actors in play for difficulty that you might encounter and that you will be you want to have some response. And analyzing the different impacts, as I just mentioned, the investments that come into play and the impact on the environment and virtual realities. The distribution methods, so not only how you extract, but the resource that has been extracted. And also how you use the resource in terms of, for instance, mining design, how do you recover the land and exploit it. So my so again, I'll structure it by different kinds of audiences. The first one is, why is information relevant to communities? Well, obviously, part of free, prior, and informed consent approach. This is the right to be asked. This is thinking about whether or not you should extract. See, if you don't understand the impact in terms of environment and extraction, you can't really assess whether you're getting a good deal. It's very important to understand what are the costs of extraction. Those costs can be a little bit hidden. Obviously, as I said, it's about water use. It can be, for instance, a mining site would suffer from water shortages. So those are things that need to be before you start even extracting. So there are different aspects, as I mentioned, managing wastes. And especially also in the case, as we recently saw in Brazil, with the in the south of Brazil for a mining site, a huge waste storage, and that broke down because one thing that you have to understand is in the extraction deeper and further, so you generate more waste. An idea to produce one ring finger, tons of waste. Development in the extractive sector, but for risk well, it can have very huge in the communities living around those sites. So in that case, those who were affected, with over 30 people, the land is contaminated, many people have been injured, and the specific case between BHP Vale and another company in Brazil. So you can, for some of the companies, you really hold accountable for this catastrophe. It's really important to understand whether the companies had put aside, for instance, sufficient money to pay for recovery if there has been an environmental damage, whether the dam is well maintained, etc. Obviously, the question of cost also relates to sometimes opportunity costs. I guess you've heard about the controversy with oil in one of the natural parks in Ecuador, because obviously Ecuador was trying to negotiate that some other countries would have the ability not to extract the resource because that would affect the ecosystem in that natural park. You have the same going in the DRC for another park. The question of how much biodiversity and how do you quantify that? So it's really the true costs of extraction for the communities, but also for the state. Because obviously the state is losing this extraction and might think it has a good deal. But if you have such a catastrophe as in Brazil, that's billions of dollars of rehabilitation that have been paid in royalties, etc. For companies, it's a big liability if you don't take into consideration the social and environmental impacts. As mentioned, you can have a real catastrophe that broke down in Brazil, but also leakages obviously cost a lot of money of reputation, rehabilitation. You have all the social conflicts that relate to the environmental and social impact of extraction. Companies don't communicate on. So, for instance, in Peru, at the end of September, there were some police killings because, look, communities are demonstrating a mining site, by a Chinese company, a copper mining site, was that environmental impact was huge, but local communities were not informed about it prior to starting of extraction, and even ongoing, they weren't receiving any information about the impacts that it would have on their daily lives. So also apathy nurtures the lack of trust, nurtures suspicion, and obviously conflict and very strong competition. So for company disruption, and obviously disruption means loss of money. On the longer term, it's a question of sustainability. Beyond the disturbance that you can have by some demonstration, if climate change sea level goes up and you have more than 2 degrees temperature, that means huge disruption to operations because you might have more sourcing and workers, that means more refugees. So for companies on the long term as well, if you don't take into account all the extraction of natural resources can have. The last group of people who are interested in social and environmental impacts are investors. And their interest is really increasing. Actually, David Diamond talking this morning about what they call environmental social issues, which investors are particularly interested at. Investors. The first profitability of the investment, obviously. The second one is to preserve reputation, because if you are, for instance, human rights toll on your reputation as an investor. The last part is to improve the general performance of the C company, because if the company does well, they contribute to a large sustain. Obviously, that falls back positively to the investors. Investors, that's very important, and we see more and more litigation on the part of investors against companies who haven't disclosed information about environmental risks. To give about ExxonMobil, they're probably being sued by Shell because they haven't disclosed information they had about the use of fossil fuels and their own activity linked to climate. That information since the early put that in the annual report, which is SEC as a major investments and shareholder value. So that was very bad for investment because then reserves that might be stranded in a few times because you can't extract it, or they're too dangerous or too expensive to extract. And even worse than that, ExxonMobil lobbied and paid different lobbying groups such as the American Petroleum Institute, Climate Coalition, Global Climate Coalition, of fossil fuels on the environment and climate change. So obviously then their reputation takes a toll. That is bad for the investment once again. So the report then looks at some mechanism that exists to disclose social and environmental information. Obviously, as I said, it's a Latin American focused report. So one of the regional organizations there, which is called ICAC, is Communication for Latin America and the Caribbean. They have a special mechanism to disclose that information, and they work with the governments in Latin America and the Caribbean to disclose the relevant information, which feeds back to, so it's the Rio Declaration Plus 20, which was done in 2012, and in particular related to access to information, can participate in decision-making processes, and has access to justice in environmental matters, and safeguard the right to healthy and sustainable environment for the present and future generations. The implementation of that principle at the regional level. Many other international organizations can't go through all of them, but I think one interesting, for instance, the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is linked to the World Bank, which has a lot of disclosure policies through its projects, and obviously you have social and environmental estimates that you can then access through. They also have a guide to human rights and management, which is very relevant in the case of free more consent, because that's how you can enforce it, because unfortunately a few countries have it as a requirement. Another part from the national level that is useful is the partnership, which is very general. It's as broad as you want it to be, and you can use any kind of information. Another mechanism more for companies, in the case of sustainability performance, is the global reporting initiative. That's also a mechanism to disclose that kind of information. And in the private sector, you have many more voluntary mechanisms. You can, for instance, go to the Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM. They also have you have that at the national level. For instance, the Canadian Mining Association, MAC, also has a disclosure policy on social and environment. So you have many private initiatives. And then you also have important legislation in place to make this information which will happen in the report in Colombia or in the Philippines. This information is public. The problem is accessibility. So it prevents companies from don't do it, and there's no central place to ask fee. So in that case, that's where the mechanism, because it actually allows you to and to make sure that the information is made accessible to the wider public. So in the case of the Philippines, they have used the EITI to disclose a range of information that is relevant to communities. So for instance, companies there, because consent has to be agreed, so it's part of the law in the Philippines, and those public but not accessible. So the EITI process is public. Unfortunately, in many places, by companies and not necessarily the results that we were hoping in terms of developing a sustainable strategy for that local community to benefit on the long term. In the Philippines, a range of mandatory environmental payments related to an environmental fund. Fortunately, in the it's reconciled. For instance, at Mongolia, where you also have some companies to invest in an environmental preservation fund, which is actually reconciled in the case of Mongolia. That's quite an interesting one. And so, in the Philippines was that they decided that the EITI process should be of the law. And they actually used the right in the Constitution that all companies through the EITI, they got access to it was important to have the presentation on contract transparency before this one. Environmental information, you actually need contract transparency. It's a very important part to be able to access certain information, because that's where you get the impact study assessments, that's where you get the obligations by which the companies have to abide. And so in the Philippines, for the next EITI report, we have all the annexes, and the annexes actually include social impact studies, and a map of protected areas, because in the Philippines they have many no zones, which unfortunately are actually being used. So the EITI is really used as a standardize, and you can request, collect, study information. That can be quite an interesting tool. The reporting templates spoon and collection of information and make at least at the national level, which is quite important. What is also important of the Philippines is that civil society a great level of effort to compile that information. So before asking to understand what is available and what is it that you need for your advocacy, the society put a lot of effort into identifying the sources of legal and contractual commitments, what kind of things need to do for companies to comply with those commitments, where can you find that information, where should you actually store that information. So this is a very important work of compilation of what it is and what are the different things that will be relevant to report through the EITI. As I just mentioned, we have the case of EITI countries. There was a brief produced by the EITI Secretariat public due to the fact that the many are resisting that. But there are also more countries within the EITI framework disclosing information related to social and environmental impact. For instance, in Mozambique, information about the environmental licenses that are given out. In Trinidad and Tobago, you have the gas emissions that are being published, in Nigeria, payments related to gas flaring. You have all sorts of countries that are using the EITI to disclose very relevant. The report ends by identifying and the different kinds of payments, because the EITI is a fiscal transparency tool. So it's very important to try to identify what are the payments linked to mental and social impacts. To do so, the report identifies six kinds of payments to be included in the EITI, and even asks for a reconciliation. The first kind of payment is what they call environmental fees. So there are fees from the fact that you, as a company, you have to comply with tax obligations that use or exploit natural resources. And that's usually to state, so that can be reconciled. The second type of payment is environmental payment. So those come from the compliance with legal environmental non-tax obligations. So for instance, the fact that you need to have an impact assessment, state, but it can also be a third party, and that makes it more difficult to reconcile. Then there are the compensation fees, which come from the environment due to the use of the natural resource, and then resource, so for instance, use of land, use of water, use of atmosphere, or you can have the type of impact, populations, etc. The fourth type of payments relate to mandatory environmental investment, and those come as a percentage, and therefore they're not based on the impact, but on the investment, the overall investment that is done, and also paid to states, so can be subject to reconciliation. The fifth type of payment is voluntary environmental expenditures. So those are voluntarily by a company, usually third parties, to, for instance, to cover for environmental impact. In that case, it's difficult to reconcile because it's through third parties. The last type of environmental penalties relate to damage, but outside of the legislation, so the noble use of resources. But I would be interested after the question to pose to the audience the question of is actually the best place to get that kind of information, and would you think of mechanisms in Ukraine that would be made more? So that's an open question. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we can talk about climate change. I'll just repeat my question about whether you think that it's a relevant place to have social and environmental information. No opinion? Are there mechanisms through which you can get information in Ukraine?
It would be good to hear from the close discussion or coming from the extractive regions if they want to use the EITI disclosure. The lady this morning, do you want to use the EITI to get more disclosures on environment and social issues?
Я хочу сказати, що інші інструменти і види їх дуже багато, але я саме на тих питаннях стосовно області, якщо брати Славянськ і багато навколо цих питань суперечливих думок. Кажуть, і одні кажуть, що це але завдяки ЕІТІ є можливість збиратися спеціалістів, до нас приїжджали спеціалісти, які могли дати фахову оцінку, і це вже відбувалося в Америці. Не довести так, чи питання. Дякую. Я все висказав.
Thank you. In the United States, what they did is that there was any resistance to disclosing that kind of information. Companies are against disclosure within, and so what happens is costs to obtain more information about social and environmental impacts. So, for instance, if a company has to use a lot of certain roads, and if you have to rebuild those roads, obviously those are physical costs that may be taken into consideration.
Я кажу, конференції регіонального розвитку Борисова, і так, що Борислав є, мабуть, промисловості і одним з нафтовидобутку. І це більше історію, більше 100 років видобування міста, що назбиралося досить багато екологічних проблем. В стані десятиліття. І, власне, зі сторони